This is a production of Cornell University.
So our first paper is called On Politicized Capitalism, and it has been written by Professor Victor Nie from Cornell and Professor Sonja Opper from Lund University.
Thank you, David Whitman and Richard Swedberg. I'm really happy to welcome all of you to the conference and to have such a distinguished audience here today on this gorgeous spring day. In what follows, I'd like to offer a fairly condensed and streamlined version of work Sonja Opper and I have done on studying the Chinese economy and transition. Put most broadly, we've been trying to organize the results of our findings around the concept of politicized capitalism, which we think enables us to define more precisely aspects of the role of the state and the transition to a capitalist economy in China. I'm happy to have this opportunity to receive your responses to this concept. Let me set the groundwork by noting that any transformative institutional change relies not only on the evolutionary bottom-up processes, but also on sustained intervention by the state. What characterizes China's transitional economy at the present time is that the state must simultaneously dismantle central planning and put in place the requisite rules of a market economy. The problem in doing this are this. In a situation like China's at the present, we can say that on the one hand, state actors are rarely willing to institute a new economic system that completely deprives them of direct control rights over the economy. It is also true, however, that company managers often prefer the continuation of direct access to state-allocated resources in an economy that's moving quickly and with high level of uncertainty. As Peter Morrell observed, there is still a much different atmosphere of interaction between government and individual economic agents in ex-socialist countries than in countries with a long tradition of free markets. We have chosen to call this type of economic order politicized capitalism, where state actors set the regulatory framework and remain directly involved in economic transactions at the firm level. Politicized capitalism is a hybrid order. The defining feature of politicized capitalism is the overlap of political and economic markets in the absence of clearly defined state-firm boundaries. The question we explore here is whether politicized capitalism embodies a stable institutional order. We maintain that politicized capitalism is inherently in disequilibrium, so that as an institutional order, China's economic miracle in this transition phase has riveted attention on the positive role of the state in promoting transformative economic development. As Joe Stiglitz observes, the contrast between Russia's transition as engineered by the International Economic Institution and that of China, designed by itself, could not be greater. While in the 1990s, China's gross domestic product was 60% that of Russia, by the end of the decade, the numbers had been reversed. While Russia saw an unprecedented increase in poverty, China saw just the opposite. In its core features, China's current economic system of politicized capitalism resembles that in other East Asian societies in the early stages of economic takeoff. Direct state intervention at the firm level is widespread, and the state's guiding hand in promoting national growth is highly visible. There are two mutually reinforcing institutional changes that frame the interactions between the local political actors and economic actors in China. First, it's the modernization of the party and government bureaucracy. Second, it's fiscal decentralization, where there's been a very radical shift of fiscal control to local government from the central government. Let me first talk about the modernization of the Chinese bureaucracy. Modernization of the state bureaucracy has been the Chinese government's priority throughout the reform period. Clearly, this was needed after the disaster of the Cultural Revolution, which paralyzed the state administration in China. Now, college education and technical qualifications have become general criterion for entrance into the bureaucracy. Many elite bureaucrats are recruited with engineering and public administration degrees, reflecting the emphasis on technical education and expertise. Government regulations and procedural guidelines have become consequently more and more precise and transparent. This has increased the predictability of bureaucratic decisions and has reduced uncertainty. Max Weber observed that the rise of market capitalism in the West and the development of modern bureaucracy were closely coupled institutional processes. As in the rise of capitalism in the West, modernization of the civil service in China has made the most rapid progress in the prosperous, affluent coastal provinces. In the course of 2 decades of reform, the Yangtze Delta region, an epicenter of Chinese capitalism, where there's tremendous affluence, it almost feels when you go to Hangzhou, you're part of Santa Barbara, California, in some of these areas. There has attained a level of bureaucratic efficiency comparable with Western industrial economies already. According to the World Competitive Yearbook, Zhejiang province now ranks 17 in terms of bureaucratic efficiency, a score of 4.31 in 2006, ahead of the United States at 4.39 and Australia at 4.35. Although China's overall score is much lower, ranking 35, it ranks higher than some European industrial countries, including Germany, the United Kingdom, Belgium, and Italy. So this is quite remarkable progress in building an elite bureaucracy in some of these most affluent coastal areas, patterned in much the same way as the building of the elite bureaucracy in Meiji Restoration and Japan in its earlier period of building capitalism. Now I'll talk about fiscal decentralization or fiscal federalism. A second aspect of the situation we call politicized capitalism in China is that there are 2 main mechanisms which work to strongly constrain predatory political interference in the economy. For example, if local government jurisdictions fail to provide a hospitable business environment in their area, they face poor chances of attracting resources needed to enhance economic prosperity. Also, competition in a federalist system eventually limits discretionary authority, predatory behavior, and rent-seeking. Local governments compete to build a business environment favorable to private capital. The figure on the left hand depicts the close negative bivariate relationship between state-owned production and local revenues between 1995 and 2004. The right-hand figure illustrates the close parallel development of waning state-owned industrial production and increasing market liberalization. It confirms that as the market economy expands, the gross industrial output of state-owned enterprises declines. In other words, the greater the size of the market economy, the less state-owned productive assets can compete with private-owned ownership forms in the production of industrial output. In our fieldwork in the Yangtze Delta, which was very much sponsored and helped by our colleagues at Zhejiang University, and we're very appreciative of their help, we found rich evidence supporting the close connection between the extent of state allocation and the value, the market value of political capital. Many entrepreneurs whose businesses competed in the free markets told us that they do not invest in political connections. The general manager of a computer company, for instance, clearly rejected the idea of playing the game of politics and explained, in my sector, the government cannot give me much, not much tax breaks, not much government contracts. By contrast, entrepreneurs in state-controlled and highly regulated markets, such as the construction business or real estate in general, told us they invest considerable efforts in establishing close personal ties with political actors. Especially for entrepreneurs who depend on government contracts, just like in the United States, for their business, having strong political ties with government is often the decisive factor in business success. One entrepreneur in the water purification business in the Yangtze Delta remarked, "Competitive bidding is just a form. It doesn't involve the entire process in terms of results. Political connections are still as important as before. If some senior government official gives us a signal, we will get the contract. Sometimes we lose bids because someone else gets the nod from the senior official." Our anecdotal evidence from interviews with entrepreneurs in the Yangtze Delta is supported by data from the World Bank Investment Climate Survey of 2,400 firms conducted in 2003 in 18 cities. And here in this table, you see the outlines of politicized capitalism in this idealized form, whereas the government frames the rules of the game. What is politicized here is that you have within the firm, the state-owned firm, the party and bureaucracy, and that they intervene actively within the firm and therefore moderate and soften the effect of market forces. And here are the hypotheses that we will be examining descriptively in this paper, but elsewhere we submitted to systematic analysis. And this is the data set that we'll be reporting from. As an example of state-controlled market, we focus on China's credit market, one of the least reformed sectors of China's transition economy. The importance of political capital for a firm's success in getting a bank loan can be readily inferred from this figure. You can see that what this figure does, it compares credit access across 18 cities for firms that do not receive government assistance, left-hand side 0, and those that do receive government assistance, right-hand side. Both government assistance and active party participation of the CEO are associated with greater chances of getting a loan from state-owned bank. Obviously, this makes sense that this is an area for rent seeking. And we see this descriptively in these figures. And we see in this table a descriptive account that suggests that the effective political capital is considerable in securing very, very critical investment capital from state-owned banks, which are key to the main source of capital. And certainly in capitalism, capital it reigns as an important factor of production. Our analysis of the effect of political capital in product markets, that's consumer markets, provide a counterexample of a liberalized market, which reveals a completely different picture from what we see in the credit market. Here we see that political ties do not, in general, improve sales performance, as indicated in the comparison of firms without government assistance on the left-hand side and those that enjoy government assistance and sponsorship on the right-hand side. So we can see overall that government assistance in securing either domestic or international clients does not affect the firm's sales growth, which makes sense. Microsoft, for example, never bothered to lobby in Washington, D.C. until there was an antitrust action against them. Before that, they focused on competing in the market. And this seems to be the case in the highly competitive product markets of China. And so we can see that there is, in the competitive market economy, no particular benefit, no evidence of benefit of having political capital. It makes sense. Why should you care the CEO is a party hack or a party leader? You want to know the quality of the goods that he provides or she provides and the quality of services in a competitive environment. So let me wrap up the discussion and summary of this paper. In conclusion, our analysis has sought to highlight the structural and organizational features of politicized capitalism as a hybrid institutional order. The focal question, which we address in this paper, is whether China's politicized capitalism is a new type of capitalism that will endure and complement the landscape of capitalist systems. Politicized capitalism in China rests on lock-in effects in sectors where political and economic markets interact to blur the boundaries between the state and the firm. Politicized capitalism is to an extent largely bounded within the state-regulated and controlled sectors, as you see in the credit market, and constrained by the extent and size of the market economy. Competition in a marketplace constrains the effect of and value of political capital. Overall, we show that China's politicized capitalism is in dynamic transition, and the future yet hasn't arrived, so we don't know to what extent they will arrive at a capitalism more similar to the type of capitalism that has emerged in East Asia, where you do have a strong state presence, but it's constrained and limited, and there's relative autonomy between the political sphere and the economic sphere sufficient to provide a civil society and freedom of expression and rights. Thank you.
So our commentator is Professor Debin Ma.
Well, thank you very much, Richard. And I want to thank Professor Ni for inviting me back. Last time I was here was in January. The weather was just as beautiful as this. I can attest to that. It's a great honor in some sense to come. I'm one of the people who lived in China, contemporary China, but working mostly on economic history. So this is not exactly the obvious topic that I'm commenting on. And this is, a very well-written, well-organized paper. And I think it's either forthcoming or it's forthcoming. So I don't think I will comment on a lot of details, and I will probably comment on the general points. And I will leave more of the details to the audience here. And bear in mind, again, I'm an economic historian, so my first suggestion as a discussant is not to take my comments, especially the critical ones, too seriously. Okay. Now, I enjoyed reading this paper, and I very much I learned quite a lot. And Professor Ni has already summarized very clearly about this paper. So I don't think I will go and talk about the details of paper. Now, one thing I want to emphasize, I think, is the paper raises really very important questions for understanding general institutional or economic issues. I'm an economist by training. One thing is, and the question that raised is political, that's one thing I find the paper is very quite balanced in a sense. Is political capitalism is a suboptimal equilibrium, or is it some kind of low-level equilibrium? You hear a lot of, because Chinese economy has been growing so fast, you have people talking about there's really no economic no problems associated. But this paper made out very clear that there is definitely a kind of problem, although they didn't stress on the distortional effects of that much. But it seems to me that there is definitely a problem there. Now, the other question I think which is most important is, and that was touched on in the paper, is political capitalism is a Nash equilibrium, or it's some kind of low-level equilibrium, and the major question is whether or not China will be able to grow out of it. And this is something very important, this is something that North emphasizes very, very often, is we don't really have a theory explaining change, and that's the problem. Okay. Now, I want to just pick on two very brief points, and again, leaving the audience on other things, on the major. One thing I thought it was very interesting is the whole quality of civil servants that was probably being improved very dramatically in the 1980s and 1990s. And they also have cited papers by David Lee and so on. I was at the presentation when David Lee was doing it, and I was also living through the period in China when these changes were taking place in the 1950s. I wasn't that old, but I left China in 1989, but so I did live through the period where there's all these changes going on. One thing I was always somewhat struck, the problem in China at the time was the bureaucracy, was of course the low quality of civil service, but the other major thing was the problem was ideology. What we consider here is something that was your right. For example, when I try to get a passport, I have the right people to get a passport. So it's not that people do not have the ability to issue your passport. It's the idea that what you have as a right is actually considered a favor in China. You have to exchange to get favors in China. So that kind of thing may not be really resolved by recruiting civil servants of a higher educational quality. And I know things have changed very dramatically by the 1990s, and I think everybody is eligible to get a passport without much of a hassle and things like that. So I'd like to see more specific evidences of what, is that really improving the civil servant bureaucracy? And I'm sure that's important, the idea to emphasize our education on the technical merit of the civil servants. But the incentive structure, I think, is much more important. And this is something that should be, probably should not be taken at its face value. We all know at some higher level, political patronage continue to be very important. And this is not the lower level, but if you're a mayor or whatever, and I grew up in the city of Shanghai, you can see the change of leadership brought such important changes to the city. I'm very glad. I mean, we have people from Zhejiang here. I mean, you should be all flattered that the bureaucracy rating was higher than Australia, Germany. I'm a bit surprised by that. I would like to see if you could cross-check a little bit more. One thing about China is that you basically have two sectors. One's the external sector, one's the domestic. I dealt a lot with the domestic sectors, people who give me a passport. And then when I went back to China, I lived in 5-star hotels, then you deal with very different kind of civil servants. Now, the question I'm asking, are these reports or surveys conducted by Western business people or asking Western business people living in China? If that's the case, you really get a very biased picture of the quality of bureaucracy in China, which I think was clear. Now, I have no doubt that Zhejiang bureaucracy, the quality of bureaucracy is probably very high. I'm not surprised that it's getting close to, say, I think in the paper was saying higher than Hungary and Czech and so on. I'm not entirely surprised by that, but I'm a bit surprised about Australia and Germany. Okay, general suggestions. Again, like I said, my comments will remain very, very general. I'm an economic historian, so I always like to advertise. I think it would be very interesting to put a bit more historical insights Something I, of course, try and be working on is the nature of traditional Chinese state. If you look at all the politicized capitalism, and of course that has to do with the fact that China has, the state has always been somewhat dominant, but of course it's much trickier than that. It will be interesting to kind of go into the history. There's a lot of literature on the, for example, the late 19th century prevalence of political patronage in 19th century China. All the business were connected with the official bureaucrats. The other big story, which Professor Ni referred to in his presentation, is looking at the evolution of political patronage in East Asia. Meiji Japan was a very interesting case. In the early period, before 1880s, it was what they called the political merchants that were pretty dominant. But there was a phase that state was gradually taking itself out of it. They were selling the enterprises. The state was, but that doesn't mean the state completely disappeared. But there was a period that they were beginning to switch to a period to a phase where they wanted the state is playing much more of a neutral role. One thing again, this is only a suggestion. What I like to see in the paper, and also in the general model of understanding politicized capitalism, is it might be interesting to adding a chronology of ideological change. Again, having lived through China, and this is something that's very, very crucial. And that, I think it's very hard to explain everything endogenously happening in China, that because country was opened up, there's all these factors going on, then things just go by its way. But I think ideological change was extremely important. We know in the beginning the Chinese reform ideology was never really a consistent package. In the early 1980s, what I heard the model was the Hungarian model, was the Yugoslavian model, and then they were talking about East Asia, and all these come with political change over time. So I think there's also periods of profound ideological shock. In the 1992, when Deng Xiaoping came out in his whatever last speech, I think that had an enormous impact on the way the economy was being reformed, and on particularly the relationship between state and society, and state and the market, and that's what this paper is all, in some sense, about. So I think it will be interesting to add into ideological angle to it. Now, the other thing I really only want to pick on the concluding part of it. Where do we go from here? And this is something I think the paper emphasized very well, is that I think the author clearly showed this in some sense is a transitional phase. And the big question is China going to grow out of it? And how does it grow out of it? And this is something very important. I think in the paper at the end there was mentioned open electoral politics is the way forward, or probably forthcoming. We don't know how it's going. Again, this is only hinted at the end of the paper, and we have all these problems. There's the closed net relationship between politics and market, which is clearly distortionary in many ways. So the authors are relatively optimistic. And I think in some sense I shared optimism. I think I will put the priorities slightly different, and maybe this is just a way to open up the discussion, being this is the first paper, is I think, again, I'm preaching in front of sociologists, so preaching my ignorance here. I think it's much more important is the element of civil society, which people studying Chinese history realize this is something that fundamentally very different from what was in the Western society. You have, what I think is emergence is much more important, the independence of professional association of universities like this. And this is, I think, much more important than probably electoral politics. And the paper is very interesting because you have several points gone into the company law and looking at all the problems, there's various inconsistencies and so on. I think yesterday at dinner we were talking about not many Chinese people really look at law at its own paper, right? Because they don't really do things according to the books. And the other things, a lot of these laws are really quite inconsistent. If you really do things by them, you couldn't go anywhere. But that shows the real problem is, and that's also part related with the civil society, whether or not the law or the legal sphere could grow independently. And this is something that should be really emphasized, where eventually, if China is going to follow by the book, the rule of law, I think that will induce the kind of changes that China could grow out of politicized capitalism. The last thing I want to say, this is all very controversial, whether or not China is electoral politics the way to go. I think it's probably much more, most people, especially coming out of China, realize And also knowing history, in early 20th century, China had practiced parliamentary democracy. The whole result was a collapse, and people never understood how parliamentary democracy, of course, was practiced. Of course, things were very different today. But what I think is possibly feasible is one of the successes of Chinese economic reform in the last 2 decades is regional experimentation, mostly on economic level. But it's possible that maybe at some point the regional experimentation on the political level could be started. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now it's time for questions from the audience. Please.
I'm very happy to hear about Professor Lee's views from different aspects on Chinese institutional transition. But I have some questions to Professor Lee, because you used the title about China's political side capitalism. In our mind, we mostly refer to Chinese transition and economic reform as the market development under the government regulation, not like the capitalism or political side of capitalism. But even from here, borrow Professor Lee's word about the political side capitalism, but you said from bureaucracy efficiency with the comparison from China to some Western countries or capitalist countries, China has a good efficiency in bureaucracy than in Western countries for government. Maybe not from the data you make the conclusion from the past 24 or 25 years, but at the current time we realize the government intervention is over-intervention to the market development, to the macroeconomic development, but the government is overshooting on providing for the public sector or the public administration and service for market development. So the deep development and government reformation will mainly focus on the government should provide more service for the public sector, for the public welfare service and public service in order to provide a good environment for the market development. So from your opinion and also from your article, what is your private opinion for the future development of China's political side capitalism? This is the main question.
First, the future we don't know about, and it's rare that anybody who predicts the future is borne out. Hopefully, people forget our predictions. But nonetheless, it's very clear when you examine the epicenter of the emerging Chinese capitalism, and this is our research strategy. Just as Marx went to England to study the rise of Western industrial capitalism, the most advanced part of capitalism in Europe, we went to the Yangtze Delta region, which includes Zhejiang province, Shanghai, and Jiangsu. And there, we were surprised too by the high ranking of the bureaucracy, say, in Hangzhou. And so one of our second visit back, I asked Professor Shi Jingchuang if we could focus on interviewing the municipal bureaucracy. And we did interviews in quite a few sectors and bureaus of that bureaucracy. And indeed, from the interviews and the quantitative evidence we collected, which we haven't analyzed yet, it's very clear that the bureaucracy is working very efficiently. Why? Because there's been a huge shift in the basis of the economy. The private sector provides employment. The private sector provides tax revenue. The public sector is loss-making, and the government wants to rid itself of the state-owned enterprise. So they have made a shift in this early 2000 period towards away from a government that is running enterprise because they can't run it very well, they're loss-making, to a government that sees that their interest is in maximizing tax revenue by building education, building roads, doing what governments do in other capitalist economies, because this is the main source of economic prosperity. This has become the main source of employment. And so this transformation that is a linked transformation between the rise of market capitalism. In Zhejiang province, the dominant sector is private-owned enterprise, and the transformation of the bureaucracy to a merit-based bureaucracy that emphasizes competence and emphasizes performance in providing public goods in a relatively efficient manner. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, please.
Your talk and also the chapter that you shared seem compatible with two very different stories of what drives and what will drive politicized capitalism. So just wanted to name the two stories and see what you think. I guess one of them is the story of the Chinese Communist Party, a basically competent nationalist leadership, seeing a very good way of developing that has some bad side effects. So, you know, the East Asian model is good. You protect vulnerable sections of the economy. You encourage sectors important for export-led growth, control credit for fast growth and without inflation and so on. But it's on a continental scale. So you have to have very, very strong control because of some of the worries that Devin Ma emphasized. And there are going to be bad side effects. There's going to be some too direct intervention. And then there's another story in which this politicized capitalism in China reflects a bad thing that's slowly being corroded by a good thing. Okay, the command economy was bad. It's going to take a while for the efficiencies of the free market to corrode it. The material you gave us seemed compatible with both stories, right? There are good reasons to control credit from outside in China, given the need to contain pressures from growth. State-owned firms, if they're state-owned in order to protect the vulnerable, are going to be less efficient. And then there are the intermediate forms that Guthrie talks about. So what's the story? Which is the story? Do you have views? Do you think your study is relevant to that?
Well, this is pointing at mainly at the efficiency and a little bit at equality issues, I would say, your two stories. So political involvement, you would say, is great, for instance, in the credit market. And this is securing that credit flows where it's best used, right? So that, in that sense, would justify, and it would be kind of a developmental state approach in the sense you're allocating scarce resources, scarce finance, and by making sure that this is kind of getting filtered through these political ties, you have higher efficiency of this credit allocation. Actually, this is one of the next projects we're working on, and we are just looking at this credit data. One reason that speaks, of course, against it is that if you are looking at the state-owned banking sector, that this has been deteriorating over time. I mean, they did try to shift these bad loans to state assets-owned management companies, where we are going to hear more about later on. But it didn't seem to be a one-time movement of bad loans out of the sector, so they had to repeat it a couple of times. So there are bad loans getting accumulated, and the banking sector does not have the freedom to actually allocate based on the market mechanism. This is also connected with having no free interest rate in place there. So I think in the credit market sector, it is still having a bad impact, as we can tell from the budget balance of state banks. In other sectors, we might see more positive effects, but these were the two areas we're actually looking at. And I think efficiency disadvantage when it comes to direct interference at the firm level seems to be overwhelming, while we see positive effects in the sense of building up an infrastructure, for instance, building up very actively technology parks, providing a beneficial business environment. This seems to be where the state is very strong, but this is nothing I would call a politicized type of capitalism. This we see in other types of capitalism where we just have a general industrial policy guideline. So I think that the beneficial effects are probably higher in those areas where the state is not trying to intervene in direct transactions and just rather providing a framework. And that is at least what we get from this evidence based on these World Bank data of 2,400 firms, plus we've added a second survey, so we are basically working on overall 4,000 firms, and this is at least the result we get from these firms, which is admittedly urban sectors and big cities. So this does not really include whole China. It's not representative of the countryside, so we have to say that.
Yes, please.
Yeah, you discussed this issue of efficiency. I'm just wondering what exactly, how you define efficiency in terms of bureaucracy. I mean, would corruption, things like that be included in the definition?
We got interested in the bureaucracy when, in the first visit to Hangzhou, I picked up a handbook, the Hangzhou Handbook, which was written for to attract foreign capital and domestic capital to Hangzhou. And reading this handbook was extraordinary because the handbook is very clear about the guidelines for getting licenses, setting up businesses. And in this handbook, which was published by a communist municipal government, it said, our purpose as a government is to create a paradise for capitalism. And they used the word capitalism. So this is ironic that you have a municipal communist government advertising itself as wanting to build a paradise for investors. And you read the handbook, and it gives the telephone number of the officials responsible for each of the aspects of public goods services. It provides the exact time it takes to complete an application. It provides guidelines for tax incentives. They want to encourage the movement of clean industry to Hangzhou, high technology, medical technology, and they provide them with tax breaks, and also tax breaks for hiring local labor. So this type of efficiency, and you have a local municipal government that has constructed a vast industrial park just across the river, and runs that industrial park of the scale that no municipal government in the United States would even attempt to think about. That requires a certain level of bureaucratic performance that it impressed me and led to the effort to do a much more careful study of this municipal bureaucracy. And there's one of the aspects of efficiency is this room they have in Hangzhou City, where they monitor and allow any citizen to call up and make a complaint. And it's a TV screen that comes in, and it shows a complaint arrives about a behavior official. It's registered, it's followed through by a municipal employee, and then it's reported how it was resolved. And that's a kind of level of accountability, at least at the bureaucratic level, that seem to suggest that type of elite bureaucracy that is responsive enough to citizen concerns that they are putting up this type of high technology complaint system.
Professor Hoffer?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, since Mark was bringing in corruption and how that relates with and how exactly bureaucratic efficiency is measured. This measure of bureaucratic, I don't know whether you're familiar, or some of you probably are familiar with the World Competitiveness Yearbook. The yearbook gives really very fine-grained measures on distinct types that relate to government behavior, etc. So the government efficiency aspect or bureaucratic efficiency aspect does not cover corruption. So that would be a distinct measure. And this bureaucratic efficiency measure is looking essentially at the question, how long does it take? If you apply for a business license, how many days does it take until you get a decision? This kind of transparency about rules and regulations, application, carrying through, and finalizing a request, etc. So some of you might be relieved to know that Zhejiang is not doing that well in terms of corruption. There is closer probably to Hungary and Czech Republic, etc. But in terms of bureaucratic efficiency, carrying through processes, and that is very important as well, of course, for business people, or if you're looking into these institutional surveys that have been conducted by people involved at the World Bank in the whole idea of business environment, that seems to be a very crucial one. But don't mix it up with corruption. China has higher corruption levels than efficiency bureaucracy levels, just as a clarification.
Professor Katzenstein?
Yeah, I like the paper very much. It's very well done. I still try to get my head around the notion of a politicized capitalism, from which I infer there is something called non-politicized capitalism. If we take the fields of economic sociology and comparative political economy, which I worked on this for about a generation quite systematically, and we just say we don't make a distinction between politics and society, we just call it polity, the interaction between society and politics, then those fields have certainly come to the conclusion, to some extent contradicted by economists, but not by many, that the economy is embedded. So if I took this paper and deleted all the text and took the major subheads, there are 3, I can write it about Indonesia, I can write it about France, I can write it about Germany, I can write it about every capitalist country I know, because capitalism is always in transformation. So why the worry, or why the imputation that somehow China is going to move from this intermediate category between ideal types, which reify the world and which are wrong, to something where no other capitalism is?
Well, surely it is certainly an excellent point that all capitalism is to some extent politicized because you have the role of the state playing the, overseeing the rules of the game and monitoring them. And so this is why in another paper that is not being presented here, we say China made the transition to a market economy around 2001, 2002. That it is performing as a market economy would in France, in the United States, in Indonesia. That you see clear evidence of politicized sectors if you want to sell goods and products to government and get a government contract, if you want to get a loan from a government-owned bank. But we see that also in the United States. If military firm wants to get a contract, Halliburton is a good example, they have political connections to powerful people in Washington. So in that sense, we can say, and I think we'll submit this argument and formally, that China is now a market capitalist economy with a very strong element of state involvement, but that's true, as you point out, in many other capitalist economies.
We have time for some more questions.
Oh. Just gives up the game, right? I mean, you just rolled over and played dead. The paper says here in the intermediate thing is the distinctiveness of China. But you're just saying, no, it's not distinctive. You can't give up the paper just because I'm an economist.
Well, I don't like to roll over dead. Clearly, the politicized and the political aspect is very strong in the state sector, which is still dominant in many regions of China, especially the hinterland, especially Heilongjiang, especially the old industrial base. And there, if you go up there, I haven't recently, but my bet is that it feels awfully familiar to anybody who had traveled in China in the 80s, that there's a heavy hand of the state involvement. And indeed, what is really striking about this World Bank data set with so many different firms is how many firms, private and state-owned, are run by CEOs who are party members, who are party officials, and they are politically active, and they're politically active because they see some necessity to having good political ties with the state. Now, it happens that there was another study that showed the less marketized the region, the more politically active are the entrepreneurs. And the more the market economies develop, the less they feel they need to be so politically active. But the recent passage of the legislation that gave private property the same legal status as state property very much was in response to the political lobbying of the entrepreneurs for greater protection under the law. And some of this is, there's a very interesting question raised, which precedes which comes first, institutional change and sustained economic growth, or sustained economic growth and institutional change? My bet is that it's sustained economic growth that leads to institutional change of the type that changes and pulls back the state and provides for more relative autonomy between the political sphere and the economic sphere. Why? Because it's through growth that government begins to realize that revenue, employment, comes not from the declining state-owned enterprise, but from the rising capitalist firms and sector. And so surely, in some ways, that diagram in Figure 1 shows the dynamics, and we think that dynamic is moving in a transition towards a type of developmental state that looks more and more like what you see in South Korea, in Japan, in Taiwan, and other East Asian types of capitalism.
Question over here.
I enjoyed the paper very much, and I think my question is somewhat related to Professor Katzenstein's question. I think this question about political capitalism, I mean, at first we may address it as a kind of definitional problem, because according to the Braudel, this great French annual historian, the study about originalism of capitalism in the West, Braudel make a crucial distinction between capitalism and the market economy. His whole project, who studied the rise of Mediterranean economy from 15th to 18th century, is trying to distinguish these two categories. And by his definition, capitalism is the monopoly and the political by definition. And the market economy actually is more transparent and more egalitarian. And so that's what I think maybe if you adopt this Braudel's definition, then the political capitalism, so it's capitalism by definition political. But I think it's maybe just a definition, but I think maybe more than that. But a second point is that maybe in answering Professor Katzenstein's question, I'm thinking maybe we can broaden the notion of political beyond the state. So the political sense of capitalism may mean that not only the state, but actually the other institutions, like legal institutions, are very much politicized in every part of the world. Like you mentioned the recent law on property. I think one of major breakthrough in this law is that people can use the intangible asset to be a mortgage, not only the land. So before, only like so many local governments are engaged in the land enclosure because they can use land to borrow more from the bank. But the new law says you can have the intangible asset that can be the mortgage. But this is very much through a political struggle, but this is also part of the politicized institutional environment. So I wonder how this is just two thoughts.
I would not have thought back that far as Victor did. So,
I might add at this point, I wouldn't agree that it's anywhere near to Germany and France to start with. And I think the essential part that kind of is a little bit neglected here is this presentation of state actors, representation of state actors actually at the firm level. We don't have a party committee in Germany sitting at the firm level and interfering in so-called major decisions and saying, oh, I don't really like if you lay off people because we have high unemployment right now. This is not a current problem, but it used to be a problem before. So this is a different quality, this presentation of the party within the firm. If the firm grows big, it is relevant for the party to be there. And this is kind of an integration process that, of course, the party sees a growing private economy and they just want to link up and they want to remain in control and see what's going on there. I agree that in most capitalist systems you have something like lobbying, of course, so you need good ties, but it's more you lobby up to the state and you want to get something from them, but it's not that the state invites itself to sit in your firm and watch closely what you're doing here. So I think there is a different quality. And what Victor said in this coming paper, like China has accomplished a market economy, I mean, that is how we come to the conclusion and say, well, that looks much like a market economy, but what the empirical evidence shows in this paper, and that leads to this conclusion, is that we don't see that a firm anymore benefits from having this political capital sitting in the firm. So they are there and they give a different flavor. You are not that independent. There is much more of consultation going on, but just having a party, a CEO who is a party secretary doesn't give you higher sales growth. It doesn't give you easier an export license or an import license. All that doesn't help anymore. That is then eventually profit. And that points at the fact that political capital has less and less value and less payoff. But still you have much more this kind of blurred scenery where you have politics and economy much more merged than I would ever see that in Germany. And I am German, so I'm very close to that. And so it is a different quality, and I would still say we see a distinct type, but we see less and less payoff. And that could then lead also to a decline of this representation, because if you don't see that payoff, why would you so happily recruit people who have party positions if they can't do anything anymore for you?
We have time for one more question, so Professor Katzenstein will get to fire off again.
The question is, just in here and suggest something to me which I think I would have expected to hear. If you take the Brodelian distinction, what's distinctive about China is it's the national model which you have and the overseas Chinese model together. That's really distinctive about Chinese capitalism. You don't find it in Indonesia, you don't find it in East Asia, you don't find it in Europe, you don't find it in the United States. And we haven't come to terms with our categories to try to capture that version of capitalism, which is based on a developmental model, the way you analyze it, and something else going on in the world economy at the same time. And so my question is, why couldn't we try to bring those two together?
Bring the developmental state with the overseas capital, overseas Chinese capital as a distinctive.
You are getting the last word, Sonia. Let that encourage you.
Well, I'm not sure I appreciate this honor. I don't know whether we could not have brought it together. I still see a very distinctiveness in the Chinese case, as we have a one-party regime, and much of this presentation might not to that extent be totally voluntary. Like these examples on, does the party come over and ask for donations? And then you ask the next question, yes, they do, and could you say no? No, you couldn't say no. So that is a different situation still in China, which is much related to this autocratic communist regime, where you at some level actually still comply with the party. So I still believe it is a distinct concept that is emerging there, at least at that time, and our concern was more to ask, is that a stable, sustainable, or do we see inherent dynamics stemming from the economic transformation that will lead to a shift?
Okay, so it's time to go to the next paper, so let's first thank the commentator and the two authors of this fine paper.